All right, today's topic is concussion and mild TBI. So I've modified this to reflect fairly current standards and perspectives about mild traumatic brain injury. So first of all, let's talk about what a concussion is. There are several common myths about concussion. First, a concussion is not when your brain gets bruised. We'll see more about this in a few slides. And you'll have a better understanding about how concussion is the result of damage to the cells inside your brain. You can have a concussion without passing out and losing consciousness. So bullet number 2 is also a myth. Lastly, you cannot always tell if someone has a concussion. Although there are obvious signs of a concussion, oftentimes we cannot tell that people are suffering from symptoms of a concussion. So let's learn more about what a concussion actually is. According to 2019 information from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, you see here on your slide that a concussion is a type of traumatic brain injury, also known as a TBI, caused by a bump, blow, or jolt to the head or by a hit to the body that causes the head and brain to move rapidly back and forth. This sudden movement can cause the brain to bounce around or twist in the skull, creating chemical changes in the brain and sometimes stretching and damaging brain cells. Next, you're going to see a video by TED Talk. This was put together by TED Talk and the Concussion Legacy Foundation. This is found on YouTube and is also part of the newest Concussion Legacy Foundation Team Up, Speak Up, or not Team Up, Speak Up, Team Up Against Concussion program that I've been working with students to implement. So this is the video.
Each year in the United States, players of sports and recreational activities receive between 2.5 and 4 million concussions. How dangerous are all those concussions? The answer is complicated and lies in how the brain responds when something strikes it. The brain is made of soft, fatty tissue with a consistency something like jello. Inside its protective membranes and the skull's hard casing, this delicate organ is usually well shielded. But a sudden jolt can make the brain shift and bump against the skull's hard interior. And unlike jello, the brain's tissue isn't uniform. It's made of a vast network of 90 billion neurons, which relay signals through their long axons to communicate throughout the brain and control our bodies. This spindly structure makes them very fragile, so that when impacted, neurons will stretch and even tear. That not only disrupts their ability to communicate, but as destroyed axons begin to degenerate, they also release toxins, causing the death of other neurons too. This combination of events causes a concussion. The damage can manifest in many different ways, including blackout, headache, blurry vision, balance problems, altered mood and behavior, problems with memory, thinking, and sleeping, and the onset of anxiety and depression. Every brain is different, which explains why people's experiences of concussions vary so widely. Luckily, the majority of concussions fully heal and symptoms disappear within a matter of days or weeks. Lots of rest and a gradual return to activity allows the brain to heal itself.
Here is a list of high-risk sports, and I think most of these aren't a surprise to many of us. About 283,000 children seek care in U.S. emergency departments every year for sports-related or recreation-related traumatic brain injuries. Contact sports contributed to about half of those ER visits. Activities with the highest number of sports-related or recreational-related TBIs include football, bicycling, basketball, playground activities in general, and soccer. The next slide you see here is data from a study that looked at 147 high schools across 27 different sports over a 3-year period. And what you see in front of you is a list of the top 10 sports with the highest reports of concussion in competitions and practice. All right, so it's not surprising. You see football at the top there. But I think people are surprised to see wrestling next, even though if you think about the physiology of what happens with wrestling, you're taking somebody, you're slamming them down onto the ground. High acceleration, high deceleration when they hit that mat. Girls basketball, boys lacrosse, and boys basketball, a lot of those are elbows to the heads or falling, hitting their head on the ground. Boys lacrosse, I'm assuming that's possibly sticks to the head. Girls soccer, likely heading the ball and also heading each other unintentionally. Boys soccer, girls volleyball, they've taken aces to the head, balls to the head, and so forth. So does this mean that you're never going to go out again and you're going to stop playing sports? I mean, we know that sports are good for our overall general health. So are we trying to tell people it's too risky to play? Obviously, that is not the answer. But what is important is that we really emphasize to athletes, children, and high schoolers, as well as college players, that it's really important to report the signs and symptoms of concussion. Okay, so here are signs and symptoms that might tell you that a player is suffering from a concussion. So a symptom is what the athlete reports. You may not be able to see the symptom. A sign is what you can directly observe. Okay, so if you look at the first one, if a player looks woozy to you after an impact, the corresponding symptom, they might tell you that they've lost their balance or they feel like they're losing their balance. Number two, the sign in this case would be a player being sick or throwing up, and they will report to you that they have nausea or they're feeling nauseous. Sick. Number three, the sign is a player blacking out, getting knocked out, being unresponsive, and obviously they would be lying on the ground and they would have a loss of consciousness. Number four, you might see a player grabbing at their head immediately after an impact. The corresponding symptom they would tell you is that their head hurts or they have a headache. Number five, the sign is that a player might be looking like they're struggling to see, squinting their eyes, might seem as if they can't see things very well, and the corresponding symptom would be they would tell you they have blurry vision. Now there are other signs and symptoms that are a little bit more challenging for someone else to see. Okay, so number one, a player might appear confused or do something that they normally wouldn't do. For example, maybe they forget a play of a game, maybe they go to the wrong team, maybe they go to the wrong location as they're lining up to do a play. And the corresponding symptom is that they say that they're dazed, they're confused, their memory is fuzzy, etc. Number two, a player might tell you that the room is too bright, or you might see that they are squinting, they're putting their hands over their eyes, and this is because they are having sensitivity to light. Team Up, Speak Up is a program from the Concussion Legacy Foundation, and they are really stressing the importance of having athletes tell other athletes that they need to report a symptom. So a lot of the research in the field is showing, there's many reasons why people choose not to tell their symptoms. A lot of it has to do with not wanting to come out of the game. They didn't think their symptoms were severe enough. They're afraid that their team can't win without them. And so therefore people hide the symptoms of a concussion even when they are aware that they have them. This is extremely important because not telling someone you have a concussion or might have a concussion and you continue to play, and if you suffer a second concussion before the symptoms of that first concussion have healed, this can lead to second impact syndrome. So second impact syndrome is rare, but it is fatal. And this is a physiological reaction that happens when you have a second concussion prior to the symptoms of a first concussion being resolved. If you have that second concussion, you're potentially too late. This is when we see somebody who ends up having a severe traumatic brain injury. I'm going to give you guys a link to a video later on that shows you the story of Brandon Schultz, who had just this. He had symptoms of a concussion. He really wanted to go back into the game. He was going to let her if he could play the next game. His parents let him go back into the game, and he was hit again. And he is now a survivor of traumatic brain injury. Let's talk a little bit about concussion recovery. We're going to talk about the need for rest. So initially, it is important that the athlete rest for the first few days after the injury when the symptoms are more severe. During this rest period, physical activity should be limited. We don't want them to be stressing their brain too much in terms of thinking and remembering activities because we don't want the symptoms to get worse. So you want to avoid activities that would put you at risk for another head injury. So no sports-related activities, no recreational-related activities, and it's important to get a lot of sleep and to allow your brain to rest. So naps might be important during this time. It's not that you need to do zero activities. That used to be the perception, but that is not the case anymore. They actually found putting people in dark rooms, no noise, no stimulation was actually counterproductive and contributed to people having going into depression. Light activity can occur as the person starts to feel better, and they can gradually return to regular non-strenuous activities. So they might be doing activities at home that are kind of relaxing, but still avoiding things that put the person at risk for another potential TBI. During this light activity period, athletes can return to school. It may be inappropriate for them to go for a full day, but perhaps they could start with a half day. It depends on the symptoms that they're presenting with and the severity. If symptoms do not worsen during an activity, then an activity can be continued. If symptoms worsen, then we need to cut back on that activity until the person is able to tolerate it. So that might mean instead of paying attention in class for 20 minutes or reading a book for 20 minutes or playing on your phone for 20 minutes, you're only able to do it for 5 before your symptoms worsen or return. Very important during this light activity period that people get maximum nighttime sleep. And research does say that that athletes should avoid screen time and loud music before bed. Sleeping in a dark room is actually good, and you want to try to have fixed bedtime and wake time schedules. At this point, if the person was napping during that resting period, it is important to try to eliminate those naps and get back to a regular sleep schedule. For moderate activity, when the symptoms are mild and nearly gone, the person can return to most regular activities. If the symptoms worsen at any time, this means a break is needed. So parents are going to have to help their younger kids, especially like K through 8 and even sometimes high school, to monitor this. Most individuals can return to a regular school schedule, but again, they need to pay attention to their bodies, pay attention to their symptoms, and take breaks as needed. Number 4 is return to regular activity. So once the athlete has 0 symptoms anymore, then they could return to their full regular activities. It is important to know that for most individuals, concussions will heal within about 2 weeks if given proper rest and recovery. But some concussions can last much longer than 2 weeks, sometimes even months or years to fully recovery. That is most typical of the case when someone has had a prior concussion and then has successive concussions following. It would be unusual for a concussion to last months or years if this was the first concussion. That would be rare. And this may lead to what we know as, or this is then called actually, Post-Concussive Syndrome. So, while most children and teens with a concussion feel better within a couple of weeks, some will have symptoms for months or even longer. If concussion symptoms don't go away, or if they get worse after they return to their regular activities, This could indicate for that individual that they have post-concussive syndrome. This rarely occurs after only one concussion. More often it is seen with repeated concussions. So, PCS is defined as the persistence of concussion symptoms for greater than 6 weeks post-injury. The majority of concussion symptoms will resolve in about 2 weeks, and with proper recovery, almost all dissipate within a month. In cases where symptoms linger past 6 weeks, that's the magic number, or unmagic number really, doctors may diagnose post-concussion syndrome. So there are a variety of therapies that can be introduced, not by us as speech-language pathologists. There's cognitive stuff that we can do, but a lot of this is also visual, vestibular, and physical in nature. So every concussion, as you know, is different, and what works for some therapeutically will not work for everybody. So some treatments patients try and they are unsuccessful, and so it's kind of a trial and error until they can find out what works for them. So patience is really important, and that's something important for the athlete to understand. It is a slow-going process, but it is important to stress to these individuals that most concussions will recover eventually. So as you see listed here, the therapies might include vision therapy, neurooptometric therapy, vestibular treatment, physical therapy, exertional therapy, and then also cognitive behavioral therapy. But this aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy is different than what we'll talk about later with cognitive strategies. So cognitive behavioral therapy is for those who are suffering mood changes, depression, or anxiety. All right, so now we're going to shift about, well, if somebody does have a concussion, what do they do in order to get back to school? I'm not going to talk about return to play. I used to cover that in the past, but really what's most important for us is returning to school. A lot of the content that I am using for this aspect of the presentation is from an article published by Felicia Conlin with her permission. So there's 3 things we need to be thinking about. When to return to school. We've heard a lot about that you need to rest and don't do any activity, and then also the potential for school accommodations. So if you are working with a student or a teenager, that person might feel frustrated, they may feel sad, and they may even feel angry because they can't go back to school right away. And they may have negative feelings associated with not being able to keep up with their schoolwork. This takes away their social outlet, so they're not with their friends as much as possible. So it really is important to have an open line of communication with the athlete and with the athlete's family about what to expect, if in fact you, as a speech therapist, are involved in the plan of care. All right, so when to return to school? Initially, you do need to rest. Researchers have actually found that the first 10 days after a concussion is the period of greatest risk for another concussion. So it is very important that we are not putting the athlete back into practice or play where they might sustain a second concussion and then have second impact syndrome. If we place demands on a concussed brain through increased cognitive and physical activity before complete recovery, and before restoring the brain's cellular function, this could actually impede learning and school-based functioning. So initially, we do have an initial period for physical and cognitive rest. This is also called the complete rest phase and is thought of as the first step in the recovery plan. That being said, this complete rest phase should last for no more than 3 days, and for most people, 24 to 48 hours might be adequate. It used to be thought, as I mentioned before, that we would take away all stimulation, put the person in a quiet room, dark room, so that we aren't aggravating their symptoms. But what we have actually found is that this can do negative damage, and the person may start to feel depressed and anxious. Activities that should be avoided initially include reducing use of cell phone or eliminating use of the cell phone, including texting, no use of the computer, and no video games. Things that can be done would include yoga, light meditation, light stretching activities, and breathing exercises. In terms of light thinking activities, this is the second step in the recovery plan. Activities that are appropriate would include listening to music that is calm and relaxing and playing familiar games, not games in terms of physical activity, but video games or other types of games. Activities that were mentioned in the complete rest phase can be expanded upon, such as the yoga, meditation, stretching, etc. Next is the return to school phase. So in this conversation, I'm really talking about the person who is K through 12. They are going back to grade school, K through 12, versus a college person. Typically, it is beneficial to start with half days or attending to school part-time. Now, whether it's like an 8 to 12 and then they go home, or if it's part-time depending on the types of classes. So in middle school, and we will talk about this more later on in the semester, if it's middle school, they might be doing an art class or a music class and maybe one academic core class, and that's it. Oftentimes, it makes sense that the student is put on a response to intervention plan, perhaps a 504 plan with accommodations, or an IEP. So we know that an IEP is going to be an in-depth document for all students who require special education services. A 504 plan can accommodate students who can learn with the general ed environment, but with stated modifications. And the hope is that this is going to be a temporary need for this individual. An IEP plan can provide services and supports that a 504 plan can't, such as specialized instruction. So it is important to determine if a 504 plan isn't sufficient and this athlete or student needs more help, that perhaps they may qualify and may need testing for special ed. It's important that communication with the teacher and the school staff is happening. We need to identify what accommodations are going to help to make the student most successful. If you can, it's important to monitor the student to figure out when rests would be beneficial, and help the teachers learn when to give the child a break. They can look for signs that he or she is not doing well and might tell them to lay their head down or go to the nurse's office for a period of time. It's important that everybody work together with the student to help the student be successful. This includes parents, principals, nurses, speech therapists, and any other, maybe there's a psych on campus, any other professionals that would be able to contribute to the child's success. Next, we want to think about, is rest best? Okay, so low intensity, non-contact, graduated exercise could actually be an adjunct treatment with potential benefits, such as reducing persistent symptoms of depression, reducing anxiety, reducing stress, and reducing insomnia that can occur after concussions. Recent articles and studies by the American Academy of Pediatrics found that those who exercised within a week of injury rather than following complete rest, regardless of symptoms, experienced nearly half the rate of concussion symptoms that lingered more than a month. Okay, so even if they do have some symptoms, light exercise seems to be beneficial and actually reduces the length of symptoms overall. Some researchers contended that complete physical and cognitive rest is counterproductive, and it can adversely affect patient outcomes, as we've mentioned, in terms of leading them into a depression state. According to the Center for Disease Control, most kids and teens will only need help through informal academic adjustments as they recover from a concussion. However, there will be those kids and teens with ongoing symptoms, and a variety of formal support services may be available in their schools to help them during their recovery. So these support services may vary widely. We've already talked about IEPs, RTI, and 504 plans. Let's move our discussion though to college age athletes. So if we look at college age athletes, what's very interesting here is that the majority of college age athletes are not NCAA athletes. They are actually club sports athletes. So for those of you in your undergraduate programs, I don't know how many of you might have been involved in club sports, but that makes up the majority of the student athlete population at the college level. So unlike high school athletes, there are no formal services such as IEPs or 504 plans that can be put in place for a college student. According to Conlon, most students only seek academic support when they see their grades starting to suffer. At that time, they will seek out the Disability Resource Center on their campus. Usually what they're requesting and receiving is extended time for their exams. By obtaining this extended time, this helped reduce the anxiety that they were feeling regarding testing and their overall academics. The last few slides focus on the impairments that college athletes report as difficult for them or difficult areas, and then some suggestions and strategies that we might look at for helping these particular athlete students. So in terms of attention, we've talked about attention all semester. We know that attention could be impaired in terms of just getting the person to focus. Can they even focus on you? Versus sustain. How long can they sustain their attention to a particular person or activity? And then we know alternating and divided attention. In terms of information processing, we're talking about the brain's ability to efficiently and effectively handle information automatically or deliberately as it enters the system. Working memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory may also be impacted. So as a review, short-term memory, we are talking about the brain's ability to hold on to information for about 15 to 30 seconds. The amount of information that anybody can store does vary slightly. We typically talk about 5 plus or minus 2. Things that might need to be stored would include lists of items, main ideas of a concept, the steps to calculate a formula, game signs if it's an athlete, or plays for a game. And these, either they get dismissed in that the athlete cannot remember them, or so they forget them, or they are going to be encoded into long-term memory. When we talk about problems at the level of long-term memory, we are talking about the ability to store, manage, and retrieve information for an extended period of time. So this is necessary for organization of information into categories. Think about when you're learning new concepts in school. Understanding in long-term memory, we can store information such as names, dates, birthdays, game plays can go into long-term memory, different signs and strategies as well. If an athlete is having difficulty with any of these long-term memory areas, consult to a physician should be made, and a request or referral to a speech pathologist would be ideal because we have the knowledge about cognitive rehab and how to implement compensatory techniques and also try to improve memory in more mild to mild moderate cases. With respect to organization, the ability to store information and use it later, and this also refers to the ability to logically complete tasks in the order that the steps should be completed. So the next several pages, or slides rather, show you different strategies for these different areas. So here we've got strategies for attention, knowing what time of day your brain functions best, such as after a nap or early in the morning. So a college athlete might be able to schedule their classes around that time of day. Minimizing distractions, changing bright lights if needed, breaking up larger tasks into smaller ones, writing down step-by-step calculations, visualizing images associated with the text, taking breaks from a task when needed, figuring out how long before a break is needed, setting a timer to take more frequent breaks. Breathing exercises could be helpful to refocus and re-energize. Sometimes taking a mental break by looking away from the task at hand, whether it be a computer, a textbook, or other activity. Strategies for information processing include graphic organizers such as outlines or tree maps to make associations with material or flowcharts. We will also look at some of these later on in the semester in the next several lectures. Using digital recorders to review information. I know a lot of you tend to record and listen to that over. That is also helpful for athletes or individuals who suffered concussion. Giving yourself extra time to process information. It does take more time to understand what's happening. Spread information over time to increase retention. So don't try to cram before an exam, for example, but gradually acquire that content over days and weeks. Review, repeat, reread, and rehearsing information is helpful. So you're sensing this pattern of they need to look at it, absorb it, give a break, take a break, look at it, absorb it, take a break. And repeating things over and over is helpful for processing of information. There are many different strategies for memory, and obviously the strategies that you pick are going to depend on the problems that the client is having, as well as the activities of daily living that the client is trying to participate in on a regular basis. So I'm not going to read through all of these. You guys can look through them all. But some of these, again, we have already talked about, like chunking information. We will talk about strategies like PQRST, which relates to asking yourself questions about the material, using compensatory techniques like checklists, flashcards, Post-its, etc. Here's some additional information. We have talked about visual imagery a little bit, using mnemonics, and I believe one of the lit reviews is actually covering that as well. Using highlighting, keywords and ideas in the margins as a compensatory technique. Putting information into a song to stimulate auditory recall. So again, using the right hemisphere to help with that. And lastly, visual aids, charts, graphs, etc. Rehearsing information before giving an oral presentation. And these are things that some of you might do on a regular basis, but some student athletes prior to having a concussion did not need to do these things. So when they have to actually spend time studying or spend time rehearsing when before they could get away with not doing it, that is a new change for them and oftentimes a difficult adaptation to make. All right, I hope you guys have found this lecture helpful. I think, we've got organization strategies too. How could I forget? Let's look at organization. All right, so organization strategies, highlighting important information worth remembering. Don't write everything down. That can be problematic, right? So creating a symbol while note-taking for items that you think might be on a future test. You could highlight those as well, but having some symbol for that would be good. A visual schedule of appointments, special occasions, class projects, events, etc. Creating checklists and using those checklists. Daily planner, calendar, and again, these might be strategies someone did use before and they can continue to use them, so that would be relearning, versus if someone never had to use these before but now they need to use them as a compensatory technique, that would be new learning. Group study with peers can be helpful because as you are studying, you often don't know what it is you don't know, but somebody else could have an insight and help with that. Breaking down routines into smaller, manageable tasks. Drawing might be helpful, so it has a visual aspect for organizing your thoughts. We have talked about memory notebooks. Resisting the temptation to multitask, which taxes the brain. So it is helpful for these students to work on one activity, complete that activity, and then shift to something else, as opposed to doing multiple things at once. Reducing distractions in the environment is helpful. Also doing tasks when you have the most energy. 11, 12 o'clock at night is probably not the best time. Thinking about when you're fresh related to when, as we discussed for scheduling classes. creating cross-off lists, check-offs, completed task lists, and also celebrating accomplishments once you have completed those tasks, and color coding or highlighting. I hope you guys have found this information helpful. I will save time to ask questions as needed in class. I look forward to seeing you all soon.